Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Mather with the Population Reference Bureau, and I'm going to be moderating this afternoon's plenary session. I have a few reminders before I introduce our speakers. First off, this session is being recorded and will be available for 90 days to conference registrants. Copies of this presentation slides will all be posted in the session page later today, and also in the ACS online community after the conference. Second, we're going to hold questions until the end of the session. So I think you all know how to do this by now, but just click on the Q&A icon on the right side of the page to post any questions, and I will read those questions aloud to the speakers after all their presentations. You can provide your name or you can ask your questions anonymously, but note that if we can't get to all of the questions during the session, the Census Bureau staff won't be able to follow up with speakers with attendees afterwards unless you provide your name in the Q&A. We would also appreciate any representatives from media organizations to provide both their name and their organization in the Q&A box. Please don't put questions for speakers in the chat. The chat's really there for you to communicate with your fellow attendees in the session, and that chat is not visible to the speakers. We encourage everyone to tweet during the conference using our conference hashtag ACSConf21, that's ACSCONF21. And I was happy to see some really great discussions on Twitter during yesterday's sessions. And finally, after the conference, you will all be receiving an email with a link to an online conference evaluation form. We hope that everyone will take a few minutes to complete that. It should only take a few minutes to do so. Okay, well, we're very fortunate today to have a great panel and you can look at the bios of all the panelists if you scroll down to the bottom of the page for this session. So first of all, I'm very pleased to introduce Rolando Rodriguez, who's a mathematical statistician at the Census Bureau, and he's going to be discussing disclosure avoidance and implications for the ACS program. Rolando, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And thank you to PRB and my colleagues from ACSO for organizing this conference and for you all for attending. I'll be talking today about a non-controversial topic, disclosure avoidance and the American Community Survey. Note I'll be referring to either disclosure avoidance or privacy interchangeably in this talk. But before I get started, I want to say that any opinions given this talk are my own and not necessarily those of the US Census Bureau. With that, next slide, please. So I'd like to start talking today about our respondents, because our respondents are, of course, a font of all the knowledge that we gain from any survey or census that we do. And respondents have to weigh quite a decision when they give us data for a survey or a census, because there are risks and rewards to participation. The Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators survey done for the 2020 census found that 41% of respondents, or potential respondents, felt that it didn't matter. It mattered only a moderate amount or less if they were personally counted in the census. The same survey found that 28% of potential respondents were extremely concerned about the confidentiality of the answers that they gave us. So when you put that together, that's a somewhat difficult milieu of data collection that federal statistical agencies have to deal with. You have respondents who aren't quite sure that their data matter, but they're also really concerned about the potential for their data to be leaked to sources that they don't want to have their data. And we'll note that even though there haven't currently been public disclosures of census products in the wild, that doesn't equate to there not being privacy concerns for our respondents, and certainly doesn't equate to there not being any privacy risks associated with our data releases. And in fact, the Census Bureau has to operate under legal titles that require us to consider this trade-off between the privacy of our respondents and the data that we need to release. So next slide, please. So releasing data under Title 13, which is a title under which the Census Bureau collects and releases data, it's a balancing act. The law requires us to do competing things. We need to release statistics on the nation to allow people to make useful decisions. but we also have to protect the privacy of our respondents. As it turns out, modern privacy theories show that those two things are very much at odds. So you have to be able to balance them in some way. And of course, if we're going to balance things, well, we need some scale to be able to balance things on. We need a way of measuring how much of a certain thing we're giving. And so there are, of course, numerous quality metrics that are used for the ACS and very generalized quality metrics that statisticians are used to using. But we often don't have a means of making any kind of useful or formal guarantee of privacy. And that's a problem, because if you're going to be operating under this kind of construct where you have to balance accuracy versus privacy, and you don't have a way of knowing how much privacy you're actually giving, it's hard to justify that you've made any kind of trade-off or decision upon the relative merits of accuracy versus privacy. Next slide, please. So as it turns out, modern privacy theory does make it clear that there's really not a free lunch when it comes to releasing data. If you're going to release useful data about a population, you're going to leak information about particular respondents in that population. There's just no way to get around that. The legacy privacy methods that we've used at the Census Bureau, things like data swapping, they had no way of quantifying the privacy loss associated with our data releases in a meaningful way. And what I mean by meaningful, I mean in a way that allows us to trade off privacy in a way that allows us to measure it against accuracy. We want to know how much accuracy we buy for the privacy that our respondents are losing. So it turns out that formal privacy methods allow us to do this, which is one of the reasons why the Census Bureau is making such a push to move towards formal privacy methods, most famously, of course, the top-down algorithm being used to provide privacy to respondents in the 2020 census. As it turns out, formal privacy methods have additional qualities too that are useful. As I show here on the graph, it lets us make a clear distinction about which things are policy decisions. So that is, where do we feel that this balance between privacy loss and accuracy needs to be versus scientific progress. So that is, how do we make the general trade-off between accuracy and privacy loss just overall better? How do we get more bang for our accuracy or privacy buck? So this is all great, but of course, people used to doing the design of surveys and the data stewards who collect data from surveys, they're not accustomed to budgeting for privacy. They're used to spending dollars to get accuracy. So now suddenly when you spend money to get more accuracy, but then you lose privacy, and this is something you have to actually weigh and consider, it becomes a more complicated situation. Next slide, please. So what we want to do is we want to move away from privacy methods that really give an illusion of privacy. So legacy methods that we use, such as data swapping, tied privacy arguments, so arguments about how much privacy a particular respondent is losing, to specific data attacks and to specific data available at the time. But of course, those things change. So the particular atmosphere of data that was available publicly on people for the 1980 census is of course quite different from the census from the 2020 census. And that's not something we have control over. In fact, it turns out there's a lot of things about data collection that we don't have control over, such things as whether a respondent actually gives us a response or not. What kind of external data do attackers have on respondents that can be matched up to the data that we release? What are the resources of these would-be attackers in terms of computational power? So what is the chance that a disclosure could happen? And we also, perhaps most importantly, don't control the socioeconomic forces that determine what data are sensitive to which respondents. Those things change over time and are unpredictable, which means we need to have a way of protecting everything. If we don't, then we really don't have any kind of control of the impact of disclosures. So what this comes down to is that, well, if we don't have control over the chance that a disclosure will occur, and we don't have control over the impact that that occurrence would have, we don't have control over disclosure risk. And we need to have control over disclosure risk. Title 13 requires that we have control over disclosure risk. Next slide, please. So we're talking about the ACS here, and of course the ACS is a survey, and surveys are samples, and so people naturally ask the question, well, doesn't the sample provide you some amount of privacy in general? And the answer to that, as it turns out, is that, well, that is complicated. So sampling has been called the privacy technique. In fact, if you look at the documentation for the ACS public use microdata file, you'll see that the reason that we do sampling for the PUMs from the internal file is solely for the purposes of disclosure avoidance. But as it turns out is that when you sample people, the people who remain in the sample have an outsized impact, of course, on your outputs compared to those people who aren't in the sample. This outsized impact can be affected by things such as weighting adjustments. So for instance, adjustments for non-response or adjustment to control totals. When you combine that with the fact that surveys tend to assess more and more sensitive questions than something like the census. For instance, the census is not asking people if they have an income that would put them into the poverty range. The ACS does. You get to a point where it's answering the question of whether or not survey sampling is buying you protection for privacy. It's not a clear answer. So this interaction between sampling schemes and privacy is something that we have now 2 cooperative agreements with partners in academia looking into. And I have a couple of links below for a description of those agreements and who's involved. Next slide, please. So then what do we do if we want to move the ACS and our other surveys towards formal privacy methods, but we're not quite sure how formal privacy methods interact with sampling? So what do we do when privacy needs lead science? So re-identification of respondents at the Census Bureau is an issue. I have a link here to our reconstruction embedded re-identification attack on the 2010 census. We feel that respondents deserve better privacy protections right now. And as Donna Daly said in her presentation at the plenary session yesterday, we are continuing to improve and strengthen the current privacy methods that we use for our respondents in the ACS. But we want to do more. And there have been, since 2005, when the ACS had its first real releases with data that use data swapping for the privacy of housing unit respondents. And 2025, which is the earliest we think any kind of formal privacy implementation could be feasible for a product the size of the ACS, there have been intervening methods of providing privacy between the two that could be useful in closing this gap. A couple come to mind. One is k-anonymity, and the other is model-based synthetic data, which is what I'll talk about in next slide, please. So the ACS is going to take a page from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which currently has a data product that is a fully synthetic microdata file, along with a system for validating answers that you get from that fully synthetic microdata file. So we're going to attempt to make the same kind of product for the American Community Survey. Now, of course, we know that synthetic data, I know this is your typical statistical model-based synthetic data, not formally private synthetic data. It's impossible to make a synthetic data set that can cover all the use cases you might have for your survey. So we're currently using classification trees as a means of making this fully synthetic data. And we're assessing the outputs of those trees against very generalized marginal metrics that have been used for privacy contests already. They've been put on by NIST. But our plan is that we're going to allow data users to see this fully synthetic microdata product and have a system for validating their output on the internal data as a means of kind of checking your answer. So like I said, this is already done with SIP. So what you do is you synthesize here via trees. That produces noise in the external microdata. You analyze the external microdata, and then you can send your analysis, since the external microdata is going to look just like the internal data. You can send the analysis to the Census Bureau, where we can run the code now internally, and then return you a privatized answer. And the nice thing here is that the method we can use to privatize the answer we give you will likely be more tuned to the type of analysis you will do than would be a generalized method like synthetic data. Next slide, please. So synthetic data methods, I would wager to say, are well known to the statistical community. We do use them for certain products. I've mentioned the SIP already, and we also use synthetic data to protect our group quarters respondents in the ACS. And of course, there are software packages that are made there to help you make synthetic data of your own. The one I'm most familiar with is the synthpop package in R. So the ACS is going to research this new fully synthetic data product. The data are going to be based upon an internal data set that we're calling the internal reference file. And this internal reference file will have no other privacy methods applied to it. At least that's the plan now. What this means is that any differences that you will see in the internal data versus the external data will be due only to this single synthetic data method. You won't have any subsampling done. There won't be top coding or bottom coding, other things like that. So it'll make it easier to have transparency about how the disclosure avoidance method is affecting the data that you see publicly. Next slide, please. So in terms of when all this is happening, I'll start on the bottom here with our research on formal privacy. As I said, the Census Bureau is involved in several cooperative agreements to look into formal privacy for our sample surveys. But I think it's fair to say that we want that research to be done right, and we want the methods that we end up getting to be useful for the outputs that people need from the American Community Survey. So we're just going to have an ongoing research agenda for formal privacy, at least over the next 5 years, likely to be longer. In the meantime, we will be developing this fully synthetic microdata product and validation system that I mentioned just previously. That is in development right now. We have started internal reviews of some of the synthetic data. Right now, we are making separate housing unit and person files. And so the next part of the research is that we need to figure out how to merge those together. Once that is done, we can move on to more formal internal testing of the synthetic microdata along with the validation system. And then once those internal tests have been done and the data have been produced to our internal subject matter analyst satisfaction, we can move on to doing a test with external data users. And the plan for how we will select which users to have for the test is we're still making those plans. But we would like to hear from this community about suggestions for how this kind of test might happen. With a goal then in 2024 to have a first release of the synthetic data plus validation system. Next slide, please. I just want to end here talking about how the groups here, so you, the data users, and we, the data stewards, can work together for responsible data. And so for responsible data, I mean data where the benefits to our respondents of answering the survey and the risks associated to them for privacy have been made clear. So there are many obstacles in the way of getting towards, say, formal privacy for sample surveys. I have some of them listed out here and how we might work together for answering these kinds of problems and moving forward for protection, better protection for our respondents, along with being able to produce microdata and tables that are useful for the analyses that are so important from the American Community Survey. So one thing, of course, is that estimates should be adjusted for the effects of privacy methods. Right now, since the privacy methods we use are rather transparent, are not transparent, you have no way of adjusting for them, right? Without knowing the swapping rate, it's really impossible to adjust for anything that might happen from swapping. So data stewards like the Census Bureau needs to start using transparency privacy methods. This is why one of the reasons we like formal privacy is that it generally allows you to share the privacy method that you're using. For instance, for the 2020 census, the code for the top-down algorithm is available publicly, and you can look at it, use it, and assess it. On the data user side, you might need to reconsider the need for things like post-processing of the data that might complicate the ways that you need to do statistical estimation on, say, formally private data. Another issue, high sensitivity models can leak excessive information. On the data steward side, of course, we need to be promoting advancements in formal privacy methods. But on the data user side, there might be a need to consider models that are more robust to privatization and learn how to use such models to make decisions. Survey practices, as I mentioned, can sometimes worsen the accuracy privacy trade-offs. So we're finding this for some methods of sampling, for instance. That means that data stewards like the US Census Bureau need to reassess our survey practices while considering the privacy needs of our respondents. On the data user side, that means we need to really embrace the total amount of error that is in the surveys. So if you're not already considering the margins of error when using ACS estimates, if you're going to want to understand the effects of privacy, well, then you need to kind of start considering all these things together and what it means to assess a particular number in a survey in the context of the errors that are associated with that number. Unused outputs tend to affect privacy for no reason. So if there's data that we collect and we release, but that nobody uses, well, that's usually not a great thing. So what we need to do is that we need to solicit use cases for ACS data from the user community. And the user community should feel free to provide us such use cases. And we are currently in discussions for what the best way is to collect use cases, because obviously for a survey of the size of the ACS, there's going to be a lot. And lastly, formal privacy just can be difficult for people to understand. I myself have a hard time understanding it sometimes. That means the data stewards need to educate our respondents and our data users on how these formal privacy methods work. But also data users need to reach out to us with their questions about formal privacy and their concerns. And we need to have discussions that can get everybody onto the same page. So with that being said, next slide, please. If you do have concerns about ACS privacy or questions about it, please feel free to email us at acsprivacy@census.gov. We would love to hear from you and we will get back, and we look forward to promoting the conversation about privacy and accuracy in the ACS in the years to come. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Rolando. For those who just joined, this is just a quick reminder to post any questions that you might have in the live Q&A box on the right side of your screen. Our next speaker is Zach Whitman. Zach is the Chief Data Officer at the Census Bureau. He's going to provide an update on data dissemination at the Bureau. I know many of you have used data.census.gov. He's going to talk about that and what they're hearing from data users. Zach?
Great, thank you, Mark. So let me present my screen. And actually, before I do that, to get this out of the way, this is a piece of wood, Chinese chestnut. It's unsecured. I had plans to do something with it, but eventually it just turned into a thing. And, you know, it could all come crashing down at any minute if Roomba decides to get frisky. So I just wanted to get that out of the way so that we can, I've done enough of these to know that there's questions in people's heads. So now let me present my screen so I can get into a quick view of the deck. Okay, so hopefully you can see this now. All right, great. So I'm here to talk about Sensei. I'm going to go through a couple things. You know, generally just what is it for those who aren't familiar with this acronym, where we started from, why we're doing this, what we're doing in terms of our approach, how we're actually tackling the problem, and then what are we hearing from our user base and what we're doing to advance and improve the system generally. So let me make sure that this, we don't need to see that. So a quick Sensei overview. We're an enterprise program that focuses purely on dissemination, not on content generation, not on collection, purely on dissemination. So from the program area to us, there's a clear handoff, and we are solely charged with disseminating Census Bureau data, listening to our customers and customer base, understanding what they are looking for, both from the systems that disseminate the data, but also in terms of what they'd like to see in terms of product development. So really, we're designed to be an advocate for the data consumer, both in a technical sense, but also from a programmatic sense. To do this, we're building two product lines. The first one is a data platform. Now, this is ultimately something that will house all data and metadata and serve it through API services. Now, what's unique about Sensei in comparison to other dissemination applications that you might be familiar with, American Fact Finder is a classic example, is that we are responsible for charged with handling all Census Bureau data, not just a subset of it. And this provides a lot of opportunity, but it also has a lot of challenges in terms of data standardization. And that's really the crux and the meat of the problem that we're working on. How can we bring all data under a single platform and make it consumable? Now, it's easy enough to just throw data into a system and then serve it up through API services. It's something that we kind of already do to a degree. If we take a look at our current API, there we go. It's basically a directory structure, right? We have a lot of data that we've put into a generalized structure that is segmented by vintage and then provider and then data set. For non-employers, this is just at the top of our data.json. You can see that it's organized in a very straightforward manner, where you have this data endpoint, which you can then go into the vintage that you're interested in, and then the provider, and then ultimately start to dig into the data themselves. And that's great in terms of a general access point, but what it doesn't do is provide any of the business logic that you would need to make an informed decision about what data set should you be using. And that's really the crux of our problem. How can we make the data that we're putting into this general system consumable? It's a non-trivial problem, because we've been operating under a number of different years with a somewhat siloed approach, where the collection, processing, and dissemination was done at the programmatic level. And then dissemination applications were, again, kind of managed separately, which is a good thing, because it was an organic development and it allowed for tailored data consumption for specific applications. But there are some drawbacks at scale when you start to look at holistically where we're potentially releasing information from two different sources, the same information. Those can get out of sync relatively easily. And so what we're hoping to do is centralize things into a singular data and metadata service. And one thing I didn't mention here is the documentation. The documentation associated with that is more powerful once you centralize it. So just one more flag to that. The other part of this is building data dissemination applications on top of that general service layer. So if we can consolidate all of these data and metadata into a singular service model, where you have a layer where you can exchange data and metadata, you can then build applications on top of that. This is how all of the data dissemination applications generally work. They all have some sort of underpinning service architecture that provides that application data. You don't generally want to load all the data onto client, onto the application, and then tightly couple things. You like things to be a little bit more disassociated, so you can update data without having to update code necessarily. And again, this is already happening, but disassociated. You can have different applications consuming data differently. And so our mandate is to bring things together under a consolidated view and then build applications on top of that. When we do this, what the benefit is providing the user with a consolidated and unified experience, because what you can do is you can start to apply the same design patterns across different data dissemination applications. Right now, if you go and you look through a few of our applications, you'll notice that they look different and they behave differently. They'll have application designs that are a little bit different from one another. If you look at Quick Facts, or if you look at My Tribal Area, they tend to be engineered to look in a different way. Drop downs look different, and as a result, we have an issue with consistency. A user who may be familiar with one application might not be able to translate the skills that they've acquired working with one system to another, because of the different patterns that we've used to build these things. So the current state looks something, or where we began looks something like this. And I showed this in 2019 when I spoke previously, and I'm sorry we couldn't get together for 2020. This is what we started with. And what we can see is that we have a number of these different applications that live with their own ETL processes, their own data transmission into different applications. And you've got this kind of organic development of these different applications. When Sensei took over, I was breaking the bad news in 2019 that we needed to deprecate AFF and move over to data.census.gov. And as a result, this is what has happened in the process. We pulled down a couple of the main applications and then linked other applications to the data.census.gov services. So we've been able to clean things up a little bit. It's by no means done, and we know that we have a lot of work still left in terms of reaching parity with American Fact Finder functionality. We are, one quick one that comes to mind is a geocoder. We understand that people want to be able to locate at address level resolution. And so we are working towards parity with at least providing function that folks understood lived in one application. There's a lot of different resources to do that, but we understand that we need to centralize things. And so as we've been able to pull certain applications within the SEDSI realm, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of onboarding other applications, as well as other data, which is oftentimes the holdup in terms of pulling in applications. Where we're going is ultimately this streamlined view where program areas do not have to disseminate to other applications or other databases. They can go through a singular pipeline, a consolidated one that decreases level of effort for them, increases the rate at which they can move data, and ultimately increases the validation processes that we can put into place to make sure that the data are being generated correctly and rendered correctly. We want to minimize error transmissions as much as possible, and consolidating this allows us to engineer further safeguards into that effect. This unified API, again, I don't want to imply that this would be the same function and the same API. It's an application layer that we would put on top of the data and service different requests depending on the functional requirements of that request. If it's a high throughput request, we would effectively be able to assert the right database or the right structure for that request to resolve it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. From that, we will be having geospatial data, the metadata, as well as search services on top of that. And that's where the business logic that we understand is so badly needed for our data comes into play. We oftentimes hear from a wide range of users that they don't know what data set to necessarily use given a specific query, because they're not familiar with the geographic variability that can occur between, ACS 1 and 5, for example. And ultimately what we find is that a lot of these data users simply throw up their hands and say, just give me whatever you have that has the best coverage. It might not be the best answer for their specific query, but they're guaranteed to return an answer because they've just surrendered to the idea that the coverage will trump accuracy in that respect. And this occurs across the largest organizations that we currently interface with, ones with tremendous resources. And if they don't have the energy or the resources available to invest in understanding our business logic, what chance do independent researchers have? They would have to effectively re-engineer how we disseminate our data to identify what the right data source is. When we survey our users, we understand that logic is really critical to their success. And we need to do whatever we can to enable their ability to query the right or to return the right data without a specified query for a data provider or a vintage. Importantly, we want also to foster third-party applications to build off of our platform. We understand that data.census.gov can only go so far. And not only do we want to build applications on top of data.census.gov or on top of the API that aren't data.census.gov for very tailored use cases, but we only can build so many, and we don't understand the broader requirements of a potential third-party application that can use our data services. So our end goal is to make the platform, the API service architecture, as user-friendly as possible for third-party developers to plug into it. And this would not only be for transactional data requests, one-off kind of transactions, but also larger requests, which is why you see the FTP bubble kind of hanging off there. We understand that there are very localized, specific requests coming into our application service layer and very large bulk extracts that are going to be required. And so we need to be able to handle both. So why are we doing this? Well, the centralized data access is the big one, right? If we have a centralized data store and we understand the data and interoperability between the data, then we will have consistency between multiple applications. We no longer have to have multiple ETL transformations from the data provider into our platform and some other platform. We can minimize that work, minimize the potential error introduction by minimizing data manipulation. That's a critical piece for us. The other part of it is standardizing user interactions. And this is the ability for a user to go from a microdata access tool, our replacement for Data Ferret, MDAT, translate their skills from there over to data.census.gov or vice versa. If you have worked with data.census.gov and then you understood the table manipulation features that we've been putting into that, you would intuitively infer that those same manipulations are available on their microdata access tool, and you'd be correct. And that's largely by design. We are hoping to bring as many of these consolidated user interactions into play as possible so that users can easily move between different applications and be effective right off the start. The consolidated business logic. Now, this is really the crux of the API service architecture for the platform. We need to minimize the level of complexity that we put on a data user. We do not need them to be data experts. We want to get them to the correct data set or a set of options that we can think could resolve their query without having them kind of guess. And we're trying to take the guesswork out of that by providing much more documentation in an accessible form through a usable API. But the main driver is ultimately the users. We are building this because we believe that we need to be responsive to our user base. You know, when we survey users, we understand a number of different things and a number of different disparate and sometimes conflicting requirements. But what we do understand is that we need to be as responsive as possible. And the only way we understand that we can do this at scale is through consolidation and focus. We can continue to support the different applications for a period of time, but ultimately we cannot support them in perpetuity. Things will continually cause additional rework. And we think that our effort is better focused into a centralized program rather than having dissemination kind of scattershot across the organization. And so we think we can be more responsive in this structure versus through a federated idea. So how are we approaching this? Well, not to be repetitious, but minimizing the one-off deliveries and duplicative ETL, that increases the effectiveness of the program to get their data out, and we minimize time to market. So we can get the data from processing out the door in a much shorter window of time. American Fact Finder, just as an example, used to have a pretty long lead time in terms of when the data were ready to begin the process through the dissemination pipeline and when it could actually get out the door. We're looking at, a couple, 4 to 6 months, depending on the specific survey. We want to bring that number down as much as possible, and we're able to do that again through standardization. We want to drive all data via the API services. This again will allow for us to build applications consistently across the organization, but also for third parties to come in and use their data and build a different or a better application for their purposes. In consolidating the UI components, this has two features to it. One, it allows the user to translate between applications, but also we can embed our API calls within the UI components so that third parties will have a quick start way to build a thematic map, for example. If they want to build a choropleth, we'll have consolidated UI components that they can really quickly pull down, begin to work with, and then style as they need to affect their specific design language. And then lastly, building applications through templates. So this goes back to that componentized idea where if we can componentize properly, we will have the ability to effectively just construct applications from a templatized, simple design. Think WordPress, think any kind of content management system where if you lay out your specification, bring widget A here, widget B here, widget C here, you have your application. When we did an audit of all of our different data dissemination applications, there were generally some combination of a table, a map, and a chart. And so we think we can lean into this a little bit and build more dynamically. So we can think about more transactional, short-term applications, but also long-term sustainable applications. Again, all inheriting the same code base, the same API, and the same UI libraries so that we can have a consistent and reliable and accessible data experience for our users. So our process, and I think this is one point that I want to stress, is we're behaving very differently than some of the other applications, like for example, American Fact Finder. And specifically, we're moving the expertise upstream. And what I mean by that is we're no longer creating content whatsoever. We are wholly responsible for disseminating the information that's given to us. And so what that means is that, one, we are able to build in consistency because we're no longer just kind of throwing together combinations of data to create a product. We are relying on our data providers to deliver that to us. That ensures far greater consistency, interoperability, and reliability. But what it does do is it takes a little bit longer. And a great example of this is Pseudogeographies. Now, I know that this is something that we've been working on very closely, but the idea of SEDSI no longer being able to construct pseudogeographies from, for example, a namespace, not just taking the data and then constructing a pseudogeography dynamically. We are relying on geography to deliver these to us through geographic metadata. This is a far more sustainable approach because it provides assurances over time, and the reliability is there because geography ultimately owns this information. We're treating this type of content as a product in and of itself, which provides, again, far greater scale for what we need to do. Instead of us generating these ad hoc, we can lean into the expertise of geography. Now I'm running out of time, but I want to talk about what we've understood from the user base, because you guys have been absolutely critical and a great partner in helping us build this application and build it better. We've seen general uptick, we've seen general adoption of it. We understand that this is not for a lack of choice, but we do understand that there is some drive to use the source data.census.gov. We understand that folks are generally dwelling on it for an extended period of time, not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. We just observe this pattern quite regularly. This could be for a good reason. Users are going in and extracting a lot of content, but it could also be an inefficiency in our design that requires a user to go in and spend a lot of time working through the system. One of our key metrics that we observe in our design is efficiency, time to completion of tasks. And so one of the things that we're constantly testing is how can we improve throughput for a user? What we've understood, well, we've gotten a lot of feedback and it's been great. It's generally decreased a little bit over time, but we're at a relatively stable state. The complaints have generally gone down, questions have gone up, and compliments and suggestions are really a non-factor for us. We generally get a lot more in terms of volume from our complaints and our questions. Not to say that those aren't welcome or really good, they are, but we just want to make sure that we keep in close eye this complaint and question ratio. And I will also stress that questions aren't necessarily good either. If the application is confusing, then we might receive more questions. And so both of these are things that we're paying a very close attention to. For some of the feedback pieces, we have generally heard about navigation, data availability, and filtering as kind of the big three that we see over time. And what we've understood is that the navigation and the user experience of data.census.gov needs to be improved, and we totally agree. What we can talk about is that we need to improve the usability of the platform, specifically on the faceted filtering front. And we have designs that we're building out and we're going to be releasing in the next couple months that will hopefully address some of this, assuming that it tests out in our usability studies. We're also looking at better exports. So better large scale exports, better presentation exports, and better non-modifiable exports. I won't go as far as to say print with a PDF because PDFs are very easily modified, but we understand that there is a need for folks to have some documentation they can take away from the site and hand over to someone else with some sense of authority attached to that. We also know that we need to improve search because, again, the metadata that we have is relatively restrictive in terms of what we can do, but we need to get users to the data more efficiently than we currently are. And we think that we can do that through an improved named entity recognition design that we are currently working on right now, as well as some improved relevancy ranking against the tables, but more specifically on the labels within the tables. One last pitch, I know I'm slightly over time. We're hiring, so we're looking for back-end devs, front-end devs, interaction design, and data scientists. Would love to chat with anybody who's interested in joining our team. But with that, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate coming. I wish I was in person. Please reach out to us with any comments, questions, feedback that you might have at sensi.feedback@census.gov or at our Slack channel, US Census Bureau at slack.com. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks so much, Zach. We have some great questions coming in. As I mentioned, we're going to address all of those questions at the end. But right now, I want to get to our final speaker. We have Mark Asiala with us. Mark is chief of the ACS Statistical Design Area at the Census Bureau, and he's going to cover some of the challenges with ACS operations during the pandemic and some of the implications for ACS data products. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark. And Mark, I think you're still on mute. Okay, we're just waiting for Mark to join us. Mark, if you can hear us and you're having technical issues, you might try logging out of the system and logging back in using the join link that we had sent you by email. While we're waiting for Mark to rejoin, we do have some questions that came in, and I think I can go through a couple of those for Rolando regarding disclosure avoidance. So we have the first one came in from Chris Clifton, who asks, will the synthetic microdata impact ACS tabular products?
All right, thanks for the question. Thanks for the question, Chris. No, the fully synthetic microdata product I described would not have an impact on tables. Now, that isn't to say that we don't have concerns about the potential privacy risk of ACS tables, but this fully synthetic method is not meant for them.
Okay, great. And let's see if we can get Mark back here. Mark, I see you have rejoined. Are you able to unmute yourself? I'm going to go ahead and go to the next question again for Rolando. Will there be demonstration data of formerly private ACS data, synthetic ACS data, with a currently public version of the data? So I think they're talking about the similar to the PPMF files, similar to what you provided for the 2010 demonstration data.
Okay. So I should note that the fully synthetic data product I'm talking about is not formally private. The tree-based models we're using do not conform to formal privacy definition. But we do plan on, for the user tests, for the fully synthetic, a test of the fully synthetic version, fully synthetic data to be available, and for a validation system to be available as well.
Okay, great.
Are you able to hear me now?
We can.
Okay, there
Great.
seems to be something where Zoom is locking up when I try to start video. And
well, the important thing is we can hear you. And if you're able to see the screen, we could advance the slides for you. Would that work?
right now, all I can do is apparently speak.
Okay.
Okay, and I can no longer, I have a frozen picture of Rolando. So
Okay.
I'll see if it comes back, but it didn't happen until I tried. So I guess if you could, someone could start my slides up.
Yep, we just brought that up on the screen.
And let me just check to see, verify that somehow my camera privacy settings looks okay on the computer. I have no idea what's going on.
Okay.
Okay.
It's a virtual conference, so we expect some issues like this to occur.
Okay, so I will we'll try to do this blind then. So with the 2020 ACS data products is overall the topic of my talk, but it's going to be a little bit getting there. So if you could Go next to slide 2. So along that way, I'm going to first do the data collection challenges. Donna Daly went over these with some detail yesterday. And we'll then talk about what strategies we used in the housing unit and group quarters estimation in order to address those challenges. And then with that backdrop, we'll talk about the impacts on data products for the 2020. And then finally conclude with a non-sort of COVID related topic, which is how is the ACS going to relate to the 2020 census? Next. So data collection challenges. Next. So we should be on slide 4. The 2020 housing unit data collection. So as Donna explained yesterday, we have our self-response modes of data collection, which are internet and mail, and our non-response mode of data collection, which is typically computer-assisted personal interviewing. Now, for the self-response, once the pandemic was declared in March, we had already sent out our internet invitations, but we only had a partial mail out of our mail questionnaire. And then April through June, because of the closure of our National Processing Center, we had to cancel the general self-response modes for the full sample. And then July through December, again, due to the limited capacity of our processing center, we had to use a limited contact strategy, and that involved cutting out some of our reminder postcards, and that tended to reduce some of our self-response rates. So we lost a lot of interviews through that process. Now for our non-response follow-up, as Donna had discussed, for April through June, we were not able to conduct any in-person interviews. And so we used telephone-only data collection everywhere with potentially some, street observations to help maybe get a phone numbers and that kind of thing. Now for July through August, we were telephone only for some states, even though we were able to do in-person for many other states. However, once we finally got to September, we were generally able to do in-person everywhere, except for isolated pockets. And this might be at a particular county level that had certain restrictions that differed from the full state. Now, it's important to stress about the telephone-only follow-up is because we had observed reduced contact rates during this time frame. And that was a result both of the fact that we have, limited telephone information for every address that was in sample, as well as some people are just reluctant to pick up the phone for in the event that they aren't familiar with the number or they're not expecting a phone call from that person. Now, if the FR was able to contact the household, that household still had the option to respond online, like in our standard methodology, and that helped us assuage some fears of maybe giving out personal information over the phone. Next, slide 5. So some of the key takeaways from the housing unit data collection. First is that our number of total interviews for the year in 2020 was approximately 2/3 of what we observed in 2019. Second is that the data collection challenges were quite complex. Essentially, every monthly panel in 2020 was impacted in a different way. And as a result, it was sort of like we had 12 different designs rather than our one core design. Second,
we may have just lost Mark again. I think he got disconnected completely this time. So while we're waiting for him to come back, I'm going to go back to the Q&A again for Rolando. Your slides state that no public disclosure from census, your slide states no public disclosure from census products. And they said this seems to imply that no one in the 2010 census has been re-identified. And to them, this sounded inconsistent with other messages that they have heard from the Bureau. Can you explain?
What I mean by no public disclosures is that someone other than the Census Bureau has made an attempt to re-identify and reconstruct our respondents and has provided them with the responses that they gave. The Census Bureau has done our own internal reconstruction re-identification experiments and has determined that our respondents are indeed at risk of these kinds of attacks.
Okay, good. And then disclosure through the FSRDC system has been negative for me because the information I use as a geographer is different from what, for example, an economist might request. What efforts are being made for small geographies for accuracy and usability? That's from Christopher Fowler.
So from a sense of the RDCs, speaking as a member of the Census Bureau Disclosure Review Board, certain models, such as random effects models that borrow strength from smaller geographies to larger geographies that have enough population to support analyses, do get through the DRB. So for instance, if you have a tract level analysis and you have a hierarchy that goes all the way up to the nation, and you can show that the tract level estimates will converge to populations that are larger than the requirement, which is that they be larger than the smallest congressional district, you can get those for DRB. So if you reach out to us, there may be methods we can recommend that might help you get the kind of analyses done that you want.
Okay, great. The next question is a little more technical from Chris Clifton. He asks, how similar are the planned tree-based synthetic data-based methods to the formerly private synthetic data methods in the NIST challenge, NIST? Could this lead to a relatively seamless transition to formerly private or synthetic, privately synthetic microdata?
So I think the answer to the former is that they're not really entirely related. There are, I think, methods for making the fits from the predictions from classification trees formerly private. We're not using those currently, and because then we have to start worrying about budgeting. But I do think generally that moving towards fully synthetic methods will help prepare data users for a world of formal privacy, especially since formerly private synthetic data is an option that people are looking into right now, and there's being research done on. I know we have some colleagues across the federal government who are looking at, for instance, how you make posterior predictions from Bayesian models formerly private. And that's prediction from Bayesian models is the original framework for synthetic data to begin with. So yeah, I think it's going to be a good transition to help people get used to what the world of formal privacy might look like.
Okay, good. Let's see. Question for Zach. Many data user questions still go to the experts in the program areas. Is the Bureau planning some way to make sure that dialogue between experts and data users are somehow captured or summarized?
Yeah, that's such a good question. We have generally considered the idea that we need to do a better job of tracking our conversations with users between different modes, and whoever they're talking to, we need to make sure that we as an organization have a consolidated view of that interaction so that we can do a better job of servicing those requests in the future. A great example is when you have a direct conversation between like the program area and the user. We need to make sure that Censi can understand what has been asked so that we can also bring that into our user database and understand holistically where the requests are coming from. So we're currently, this is a collaboration work we're doing with our communications directorate, where they're building a customer a CRM, which is a way in which we can consolidate the interactions between the outside world and Census, regardless of if they're a partner, if they're a general API user, a general data consumer. We want to make sure that we can consolidate that information and have a holistic view of the types of questions that we're getting. And you know, a question coming in from one aspect might have relevance to our domain. We just need to make sure that we consolidate that data and use it appropriately. So yeah, we're definitely focusing on that, and it's a multi-year effort. Again, a lot of these things are, but we're making headway, and that's where all of our feedback that we collect from Censi goes into. So we have been subscribing to this platform for a bit, and hopefully contributing to AdCom's work as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Zach. We are still waiting for Mark to rejoin. So if people have any questions for the first two speakers, Rolando or Zach, please type them into the question and answer box on the right-hand side of your screen. And Mark is trying to rejoin us right now. Hi, Mark, can you hear me? It looks like your microphone is on, Mark. Are you able to hear me? Okay, I'm not sure we're going to get Mark back here. He has now dropped off, or no, I see you're still there, Mark, but your microphone is turned off. We have a CVent technical support staff person here. Carol, do you have any suggestions at this point? Should Mark try to rejoin through the web browser, or is there some other potential solution for him?
I actually sent the link for the green room to him, and he needs to try to go back into the green room for some further troubleshooting.
Okay. Well, we will give him another couple of minutes here.
Carol, is there any way that he can dial in by phone so that we can just have his audio while we show the slides?
Let me check real quick for you. Give me one moment, please.
As a backstop, is there anyone from the Census Bureau who has happened to review Mark's slides and might be comfortable providing a high-level summary of those if he's unable to join?
Excuse me for, this is Carol. Actually, there is no dial in for this, so I am very sorry about that.
Okay.
So Mark has just emailed to say that he tried using the Zoom web browser and it locked up, and he is rebooting now.
Okay. Well, for those attendees who are still with us, if you want to go take a 5-minute break, I'm hoping that we will be able to get Mark back with us in a few minutes. And we will I'm just going to be on pause here and wait for him to rejoin, hopefully in a couple of minutes. Sorry about the delay.
This is Linda. Will whoever typed in the pending questions that they could step in? Could you let me know could you let us know who you are so we can email you the link to join as a speaker? Okay, will do.
Hello, are you able to hear me now?
Yes, hi, Mark.
Have you ended the session at this point?
No, we told people to just take a couple minute break and we still have plenty of time. So would you like to?
Ended up having to do I ended up doing a computer reboot because after I had done a force quit of Zoom several times.
Okay, well, that's fine.
So you made it to slide 5, is that?
Yes, can you see that slide up on the screen now?
I can.
Okay, I think that we're okay to restart then.
So in terms of, it is 2:06. So I don't know where we are. Where are we with in terms of questions for the other speakers or that kind of thing? Did you take care of? Did you address some of those? While...
Yes, we did. So we got through most of the questions for Rolando and Zach. So I think if you want to go to 2:15, we'll still be in good shape.
So at 2:15 means that I will probably focus on just one aspect of the housing unit estimation and then jump to the slides on the data products. And there will be, and we'll have to pick and choose slides there in order to get done in the 8 minutes or so.
Okay, that works.
Worked all the way up to the point of when I started to speak. Okay, so when is the audience due to be back on?
I think you can start now. I think that some people may have stepped away, but some are probably just in hold mode. So why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me now. Apologize for the technical difficulties. I'll have to abbreviate my talk, but my full set of slides will be available after today's session, and you can look at things there and direct questions to me via email if necessary. So some key takeaways here on slide 5 was that from our housing unit data collection, our number of annual interviews was only about 2/3 of what we had in 2019. And the data collection challenges were very complex in that every monthly panel in 2020 was impacted in a different way. And this sort of made it like 12 different surveys in terms of methodology. And our telephone only follow-up also depended both on month and geography. And so this introduced additional complexity. Now, conducting the follow-up operation using only the telephone introduced some additional issues. Next slide. And this is actually one of the key things I wanted to focus on, is that the in-person follow-up operation is our principal method for identifying vacant housing units. And using only the telephone to conduct follow-up operations limits our ability to identify those vacants. Early results show that our field staff were able to identify some types of vacant housing units better than others. So for example, if the field staff was able to drive by, see a for rent sign, see a phone number, they could go back and call that phone number and see if that unit was vacant. So overall, we had a reduced identification of vacant housing units, and we observed a bias in the type of vacant housing unit. Next slide. Now, just say in general, group quarters, data collection was suspended for April through June. And then when we came back, we had some particular challenges that varied by type of facility. And I'm a little bit restricted on time, so I'm going to focus on the college dorms because that came up yesterday during the plenary session. That was one of the key things we found, was that college dorms were vacant in the fall months, even though they may have been occupied in the spring. And so that was something that we knew was going to cause problems on our estimation, and we had some specific steps to address that. And I'll talk about that in our estimation slides. So if you go to the next slide. So housing unit and household population estimation. Next. So we had two issues. I'm going to focus primarily on the first one, given the time. Is we wanted to mitigate the reduced identification of vacant housing units in the field and the skewed distribution on the type of vacant. We also needed to mitigate that potential increase in non-response bias. And it was very important to us that we would be able to explain this methodology, whatever that we came up with, and that it be understood by both internal and external stakeholders. It was also very important to us that we could not introduce an undue risk into our processing systems that could cause schedule delays or unintended consequences. Next slide. So quickly, why is the vacancy rate so important? Well, in a nutshell, this slide is showing is that the vacancy rate, if you improve that, you improve the occupancy rate, because those two are bound together by that first relation. Then if you improve the occupancy rate, you improve the estimate of occupied housing units. And those universes of occupied housing units, households, and householders are all equal. So if you improve the vacancy rate, you improve all three of those universes. And the ACS produces a lot of tables that are based on households and householders. Next slide. So we knew that the non-contacted housing units included both occupied and vacant units. So what we did was we addressed the issue in sort of two ways. The first aspect is we created a model to predict which of those non-contacted housing units were vacant. And for this, we used a model that had been developed for the 2020 census that had been well researched and well understood. It made use of various administrative records, Postal Service, and ACS data. And we used that model to impute about half of the expected missing vacant housing units. We then used weighting adjustments to account for the remainder. And those weighting adjustments, what we did was essentially use the balance of the year where we had our full data collection, in-person follow-up, the whole thing, as our benchmark for those telephone-only periods so that we could have a reasonable vacancy rate. Next slide. Now our non-response bias steps, I'll reduce this down to a small nutshell, which is what we did is we made use of the population estimates that are already available on a monthly basis for state and national population totals by demographics. And we use those as controls for either months or a group of months. And by doing so, we could try to mitigate that non-response bias that was different from month to month. And by making each month more representative, we could make the annual estimates as a whole more representative. Next slide. So now group quarters estimation. Now I want to, again, focus on the college dorms. So if you could advance 2 slides, please. Yes. So our issue with college dorms is that the GQ estimation uses the population estimates as controls. And these estimates were not adjusted for the COVID-19 impacts. So we have a control that is the size of a normal college dorm population. Now that's at odds with the fact that the ACS observed that while many of these dorms were all occupied in the spring, many of them were vacant in the fall. And we didn't have any information on how to adjust those population estimates because we didn't know where that displaced population went. It was in the surrounding community and within the same state or even across state lines. And if we'd used our standard methodology, it would have caused either a large under or over representation of the dorm population in local areas. So to avoid these distortions, really our only option was to treat those vacant dorms as occupied. And then within our standard methodology, we do whole record imputation of records from interviewed college dorm students into these otherwise would have been vacant dorms. So the result is that the college dorm population as a component of the total resident population is going to look more normal than what you would expect. Next slide. So now would have liked to have had more of this background, but we want to talk about some specific impacts on the data products based upon the data collection and on our estimation approaches. So next slide. So the first thing is having only approximately 2/3 of the number of interviews, our margins of error are generally going to be 20 to 30% larger on average based upon those reduced number of interviews. So as an example, an estimate of 1,000 plus or minus a margin of error of 100 would become 1,000 plus or minus a margin of error of 120, which is 20% larger. Now, a key item I want to stress on our second bullet is that the estimation is not a miracle cure. It's not a silver bullet. It can help improve the estimates, but it cannot remove the limitations of the data collection. It will still be there. And so for this reason, when you look at 2020 within the time series of ACS estimates, 2020 may look like an outlier. And that can be because of either real changes that occurred or the limitations of the data collection and our ability to mitigate those limitations. And it can be difficult to tell which is which. Now, the impact will be greater for the 1-year estimates than for the 5-year, because the 5-year, with its longer period, has a greater ability to kind of ride over some of these data collection disruptions. So that will be an important thing to note as you make use of the data. Next slide. Now, since I explained briefly, we did specifically target to try to mitigate the impact on the vacancy rate. So you can expect that the gross vacancy rate as well as the homeowner and rental vacancy rates will tend to be improved. They will, however, largely reflect those vacancy rates as measured in the first couple months of 2020 and in the last 6 months of 2020. So they won't quite represent the full year, but they'll represent the majority of the year. You can expect that the base demographics like race, Hispanic, age, and sex that are controlled to the population estimates should be minimally impacted. But when you get to other characteristics, those will require a more nuanced or individual review, both for the characteristic and for the geography. Now, anything we learn, we will share with you on release day in terms of advice of should you compare or not compare. But it will also be important to use your own local knowledge to judge the reasonableness. Next slide. Group quarters, I think I covered the major bullet I wanted to cover, which was the second bullet, that the college dorm population is going to look more normal than you would expect. So let's go to the next slide. Now, the public use microdata sample, at this point, there's only a minimal amount of information I can share, but if you look at the proportion of ACS interviews that we release on the PUMS files, it's very similar to what we see in the reduced number of interviews that we have for 2020. And it's going to limit our ability to create sort of a full-size PUMS file. So normally we would release a 1% sample of the total housing units in each state. So, we would release, if there were 100,000 housing units in that state, we would release a file with 1,000 records. This year, it may not be 1,000. It might be 900. It may be 800. It will depend on the state. And as we get closer to the PUMS data release, we'll provide additional guidance. Next slide. Now, for sources of data quality, I think we've hammered it home a couple times today. Pay attention to the margins of error. They will be larger than in years past, so they become even more important to look at. You get a plug for our quality measures page. You can go to the URL on the bottom. That will provide more information. You should be able to look at that for sample size and interview counts and response rates and all of the items listed. And certainly when it comes release date in September, we will have a wealth of information on our data release page. And we also plan to have some extended user notes in addition to the blogs that we are anticipating releasing over the summer. Next slide. Now for the ACS compared to the census, I wanted to focus primarily on geography and population. So next slide. So for geographic definitions, the comparability between the ACS and the census is going to be very similar to what we had in 2010. We'll tend to have the same geographic definitions everywhere. There will be 3 exceptions: zip code tabulation areas, urban areas, and public use microdata areas. And that's because these areas have not yet been redefined based upon the 2020 census. They will instead be released on a delayed schedule, the same schedule we had a decade ago, as shown there on the slide. For more information, you can go to the link there. I'll also provide all the links at the end of my talk. Next slide. Now for the population estimates as controls, if you saw the presentation by Tori Velcroft, she discussed how the census compared to the vintage 2020 population estimates. Now those vintage 2020 population estimates are the same ones that the ACS will use as controls for this year. Normally speaking, the controls we would use would be informed by the 2020 census, but because of delays in processing, we will not be able to, those will not be available for us to use. So they're informed only by the 2010 census. Now, in terms of the impact, the national total resident population for the vintage 2020 controls is about 2 million lower than the census equivalent population. So you can expect greater differences between the ACS and the census population totals this time around in 2020 than what you may have observed in 2010. However, in 2021, we expect that the ACS data products will be the first products to make use of the population estimates that are informed by the 2020 census. So you can look forward to that next year. And again, we have a more detailed user note on this on our website. And next slide. And thank you for bearing with me today. And there are all the links that I had provided. And thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. That was very informative. I'd like to ask the speakers to, if you could turn on your cameras. We still do have about 7 or 8 minutes left for Q&A. We have some more questions that have come in, and I'll get to as many of these questions as I can. And I'll start with you, Mark. A question from Doug Hilmer. If the margins of error in the 2020 data products will be so much higher, will data quality filtering suppress more tables in geo areas than usual? And if so, is there some accommodation that the Census Bureau can make to avoid major holes in the release data?
So Doug Hilmer refers to our data quality filtering, where we look at sort of an average uncertainty in the estimates for a particular table. And if it's too high, we suppress the entire table. We do anticipate that we will have a higher filtering rate for 2020. It will generally sort of be on order of the sort of directly proportional to the increases in the margins of error. We'll know better as we come closer to release day, but we're not planning anything separate or in addition to what we normally would do in a normal year for the data quality filtering.
And a follow-up question from Doug. If the 2020 sample was hit so hard by the pandemic with 2/3 of the 2019 interview sample, would that provide an opportunity to try out some of the synthetic data methods to increase the sample size?
So you could, but the synthetic data methods are only as robust as the source data that go into those methods. And so if you base that on the smaller sample size, that you could increase the overall number of records that we tabulate, but their data quality would suffer some because they're based on a smaller input data set.
Okay, great. This is a question for Rolando. Someone asked if you could speak a little bit more in depth about how data users will be involved in the process of testing and transitioning to the synthetic data.
So as I said in my presentation, I think that the main effort is going to be through this, end user test that we plan in a couple of years. We are still having discussions internally about how to organize that, how to get the word out. But the goal is very much to start, looking at particular analyses that data users might want to do, seeing how they're affected by the synthetic data, but also scaling the validation system because, the current example we have for validation is SIP, but that's mainly just a power user community who uses that. So there'll be a lot of scaling that will need to be done for our validations. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely going to need user input, but we're still having discussions about the best way to do that.
Okay. Next question from Erica Gardner. How is DP applied to the 2020 census going to impact the weighting of the ACS, particularly the occupancy rates and household sizes of smaller areas?
Well, I think my answer would be we don't currently know because we haven't finished, development of the 2020 DAS, but I should probably also let Mark weigh in on that.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question part of it?
Yeah, the question is how is the differential privacy that's being applied to the 2020 census going to impact the weighting of the ACS, particularly the occupancy rates and household sizes for smaller geographic areas?
So right now, that those DP methods for the 2020 census don't translate directly to the ACS. Those are really designed for use with what we call unweighted data, which is a census because everyone counts just as one. With the weighted estimates that we have from a survey, it becomes much more difficult to understand sort of what would be keyed on. Otherwise, the occupancy rates that are measured by the ACS come directly from the ACS and not from the census.
Okay, and this is going to have to be our last question here. This person says, not related to ACS, but related to the decennial, wondering if the noise being injected into the DHC and the detailed DHC tables, are those considered counts or estimates, and will they have margins of error associated with them?
I do not know final plans for how we're going to address expressing the error due to the formal privacy methods. As Tori Velkoff said yesterday, we will, for each geography, give an output of the particular budget that was used for that geography, which will give a general sense of the variance added to the numbers. But I would not call these estimates. Estimation is what you do with numbers like this. So just my opinion.
Okay, thanks, Rolando. We are almost out of time. And so before we close, I just want to thank the three speakers again for joining us. I apologize for the technical issues. Very informative updates about the ACS program. Since this is the last plenary session, I also wanted to take this time to thank the Census Bureau for sponsoring this event, all the Census Bureau staff who led product demonstrations, roundtable discussions. We also had lots of data users leading those roundtable discussions, and also our ACS planning committee, they were really instrumental in putting this program together. There are 2 more great breakout sessions this afternoon. We have a 10-minute break right now, but we hope that you'll stick around and attend one of those sessions, and sessions will resume at 2:40 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you all for joining. This concludes